Good evening. If you will, take your Bibles and turn to Hosea. Hosea is the book we're going to look at tonight. You know, the Bible has several ways of conveying the gospel message. One of those ways is by using certain key words that you can trace throughout the Bible and find the drama of the gospel, but in the sequence of it at least. For example, you can start with the word seed in Genesis and just note how seed kind of develops from Genesis all the way to Revelation. And what you'll have is the gospel story. Another way of doing that is to look at one book in the Bible, like Romans, and you could look at the word glory in Romans, and you will find that if you trace that word in Romans, you'll find something similar. You'll find a gospel message, the gospel message. Well, Hosea is another one of those books. You can do that with the word return. Return. At least the Hebrew word that's usually translated return or turn. And that's the word shuv, just in case you're curious about that. If we're going to look at this word in Hosea, and we're going to make 3 points tonight. This single word in Hosea shows us at least these 3 things. Number 1, it shows us the nature of sin, its destructiveness, and its consequences. Number 2, shows us the nature of God, His repulsion against sin, and His determination to extract it from the world. And number 3, it tells us about our hope in spite of our sin, which springs from God's promises. And so, to get really simple, the point number 1 is about sin. What does this word in this book teach us about sin? What does it teach us about God? And what does it teach us about our hope? So that's what we're going to look at tonight. Now, we're only going to be in Hosea. And Hosea is one of those minor prophets that often gets neglected. Those poor minor prophets. Nobody seems to really care about them. But Hosea is right after Daniel. And Daniel is kind of a more popular known book, so just in case you're having trouble finding it. Hosea was one of the earliest prophets as far as the prophets who wrote books. There were several prophets through Israel's history. Before the prophets began writing books, as far as we call them prophets, the major prophets and the minor prophets. There are a whole bunch of prophets before them. But once they start writing specific prophetic books, it begins around Hosea's and Amos's time. That was the 8th century BC, or the 700s. Now, the 8th century in Israelite history was a wild ride. The northern kingdom, the kingdom had split back about 300 years before that time. And so Israel as a kingdom has been going on for 300 years. But you have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and the northern kingdom is on its last leg. And God starts sending prophets to Israel, the northern kingdom, and announcing that you're done. I'm done with you. You've had your time. Here's the warnings. Assyria is going to come in and take over. Here's some promises if you keep faithful, but all in all, the northern kingdom is going to come to an end. It's over. And so it's kind of like the prophets, once they start writing books, the prophet books, they are kind of going to the people when the people are on life support, morally speaking. And God uses those prophets, like Hosea, to kind of give advance information of what's going to happen to them because of their sin, but he's also trying to shock them back into faithfulness to God. As they break the covenant, he's wanting them to renew the covenant. And that's kind of like the hope that the prophets have. That they hope the people listen to them and they hope the people turn, but it always looks like that's not going to happen. The majority of people usually do not listen to wisdom and do not listen to the ways of God, and they go their own ways instead. That's kind of the story of humankind. But we can see that at this point in Israel's history, the northern kingdom of Israel has become extremely corrupt. Just to get a little taste of how corrupt it was, a good passage to read on this is Hosea chapter 4. Hosea chapter 4, verses 1 through 14. I'm going to read this section first, give a little bit of commentary, and then we'll talk about our 3 points. So this is just to set the stage of this is the type of society it was. This is the type of society that Hosea was sent to preach to. So chapter 4, verse 1, hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. That word controversy is like the word for a legal charge or a legal accusation. And so God is suing, in a sense, Israel. And he's sending the prophet kind of as his prosecutor. He says, there is no faithfulness or steadfast love, no knowledge of God in the land. And note that phrase, knowledge of God. Knowledge of God becomes key in this passage. So there's no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, verse 2, murder, stealing, committing adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. There's almost like a listing out of the 10 Commandments, and he's saying, yeah, you are not doing any of them very well at all. Verse 3, therefore the land mourns, and all who dwell in it languish. And also the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. So corrupt is their sin and their evilness that even the animals are affected by it in some way. Verse 4, yet let no one contend, and let none accuse. For with you is my contention, O priest. So note that he is pointing out the priests in this section. The priests were supposed to be the most religious in the land, the people who care most about following the law and understanding the law. And one of their jobs was to teach the people the law of Moses, to educate the people on each generation on the ins and outs of the law of Moses. And so in a lot of ways, if the people didn't understand the law very well, the ultimate responsibility came back on the priests. They were kind of the ones who, that's their job, they dropped it. And now it looks like that's what's happened here, is that the priests haven't been doing their job of teaching the people. And so he's saying, normally a priest is the type of person that God would send to contend, to show that he has a contention with somebody. But God's kind of saying here, well, there's no good priest to use, so I'm going to do it myself with Hosea. Now, verse 5, you shall stumble by day, the prophet also shall stumble with you by night. So you have that mention of priests and prophets. So there were also other prophets there besides Hosea, but apparently they weren't faithful either. And I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. because you have rejected knowledge. I reject you from being a priest to me. And since you've forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. So he's bringing up the idea of knowledge again, like he did in verse 1, talking about there's no knowledge of God in the land. Well, he's saying, you're withering away because of a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding. Well, why do they have this lack of knowledge? And what is this knowledge supposed to be about? Well, it looks like it's supposed to be about the law of God. They're supposed to know the law, and they're supposed to do the law, but the efforts of education on that front just has gone by the total wayside. And so there's a bunch of ignorance in the land concerning the law. And he's saying, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge because you have rejected knowledge. So he's saying it's not just that, y'all didn't have the right information in front of you. He's saying, no, you guys have intentionally rejected the knowledge that's available to you. You have not used it. You have not taken advantage of the resources that you have. And therefore, you're responsible for that. You've forgotten the law, so I'll forget you. Verse 7, the more they increased, the more they sinned against me. I will change their glory into shame. They feed on the sin of my people. They are greedy for their iniquity. And it shall be like people like priests. You see this principle in the prophets that the people as a group can only be as good as the leaders are. And so if the priests are corrupt, it will naturally flow down that the people in general will be corrupt. Now there will be exceptions here and there. Hosea was one of them. Amos was another one. But in general, the priests have a lot of influence on what happens with the nation. And it shall be like people like priests. I will punish them for their ways and repay them for their deeds. They shall eat but not be satisfied. They shall play the whore but not multiply, because they have forsaken the Lord to cherish whoredom, wine, and new wine, which take away the understanding. It looks like he's talking about like drunkenness there. Drinking alcohol like this apparently was something normal at that time in the Israelite history. And Hosea is blasting him for it. And then he says in verse 12, my people inquire of a piece of wood, and their walking staff gives them oracles. So he's pointing to their idolatry. They are using statues, wooden statues, and even their walking staffs. They're using those as means of understanding God's will. And they think somehow by using these pagan rituals, they'll understand what God's up to better and what God wants them to do. And Hosea is just showing like this is totally unlawful as far as the law of Moses goes. He says, for a spirit of whoredom has led them astray, and they have left their God to play the whore. They sacrifice on the tops of the mountains and burn offerings on the hills under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is good. So now he brings up another aspect of their lives, sacrifice and worship. It's not that they've given up sacrificing and worship. They are sacrificing, and they are doing a lot of acts of worship. The problem is they're not doing it the way God told them to do it. The thing about the worship in the Old Testament is worship and sacrifices were very regulated in the law of Moses. And so it was very specific about who could sacrifice, when you sacrifice, what you sacrifice for what occasions, and what you sacrifice for what purposes, and then the personnel who are involved with the sacrifice, and the place and the location of sacrifice. All of these things were important details in the law, and it looks like the people, they're just sacrificing wherever they want. It says, because their shade is good. It's convenient. they like it better to do it their way. He says, therefore your daughters play the whore and your brides commit adultery. I won't punish your daughters when they play the whore, nor your brides when they commit adultery, for the men themselves go aside with prostitutes and sacrifice with cult prostitutes. In other words, yeah, there's a whole bunch of prostitutes, but the bigger issue here is the men in the society in Israel are making a big customer base for the prostitutes. So the men are pointed out as taking a lot of the responsibility for that. He says, they sacrifice with cult prostitutes, and a people without understanding shall come to ruin. So that passage gives us kind of a good tour of what a typical big town in northern Israel would have been like at this particular time in the 700s BC when Hosea goes and preaches. Doesn't look that much different than our society now in a lot of ways. And it doesn't even look like these are the people of God. That's what Israel looks like. They've fallen so far. And you'll read in Hosea, God is just pretty much done with them. And he's saying, you've got a limited amount of time to survive as a nation, and then we're through. Well, so that's our background we're going on here in Hosea. So let's talk about sin, God, and hope, and how this word return plays in structuring those concepts. Sin, number one. Let's talk about what we can learn from sin in Hosea. Look at chapter 7, verse 16. Chapter 7, and starting in verse 11 to get the context, it says, but because Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning, they have become to him altars for sinning. Were I to write for him my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. As for my sacrificial offerings, they sacrifice meat and eat it, but the Lord does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt. Remember, the word return is the word I'm trying to highlight tonight throughout Hosea. So he says, because of they have sinned, he is going to return them to Egypt. That's kind of a reversal of the Exodus. Now I was reading chapter 8, verse 14, not chapter 7. So let's look at chapter 7 and verse 14. Chapter 7 and verse 14, it says, they do not cry to me from the heart, but they will wail upon their beds. For grain and wine they gash themselves. They rebel against me. You remember on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18, the showdown between Elijah and the priests of Baal. And the priests of Baal, they were praying to Baal for the rain, and they did it all day, and no rain was coming. And it mentions that they were gashing themselves and making themselves bleed as kind of a gesture to Baal that, hey, we really care about this. Please listen to us. That seems like what's going on here. It's a pagan type ritual. These Israelites are doing that. It says, but they wail upon their beds for grain and wine. They gash themselves. They rebel against me. Although I trained and strengthened their arms, yet they devise evil against me. They return, but not upward. So there's our word, return. They return, but not upward. They are like a treacherous bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword because of the insolence of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. So he's saying, yeah, you are looking like you are returning all right, but it's not really to me. It's not really the right way of repentance. You're actually turning to Baal. You're turning even more fundamentally than Baal. You're turning to yourself and serving yourself. And the people refused to return to Yahweh. Look at chapter 7 and verse 10. Chapter 7 and verse 10, it says, "The pride of Israel testifies to his face. Yet they do not return to the Lord their God, nor seek him for all this." The pride of Israel testifies to his face. I think the meaning there is kind of like, this is obvious. Your corruption is obvious to everyone in the society, and it's only the foolish who try to ignore it and pretend that it's not there and that it's not happening. And so he's saying, I am exposing that pride, yet you don't return. Yet they do not return to the Lord their God, nor seek him for all this. So God is almost saying, look, I'm making it as easy as possible for you to come back to me. I am showing you the way to do it. All you have to do is humble yourself and follow it. But they're not doing it. It's the stubbornness of sin. You see, that's one of the problems with sin, is that it leads to just a resolute stubbornness, a foolish stubbornness. Look at chapter 2, verse 7. Chapter 2 and verse 7. In this section, it's describing Israel kind of as a wife, and it looks like God as a husband, and the wife has been unfaithful to the husband. And so the husband, God, is describing this scenario and how he feels about the whole thing. In verse 7 it says, "She shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them, and she shall seek them, but shall not find them. Then she shall say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better for me then than now." Okay, so there's Israel kind of personified as the wife, the unfaithful wife. She's been running around, just doing her own thing. And it even says in verse 5 that she was saying that her lovers were the ones that are giving her all her blessings in her life, like food. But then life got hard, kind of like the prodigal son, and she says, well, I'll go and return to my first husband, because things were better then than they are now. But the passage goes on to kind of give to see that no honor in that statement. It says, verse 8, "And she did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, the oil, and who lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. Therefore I will take back my grain in its time and my wine in its season. I will take away my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness." And he goes on and on to talk about how he's going to return her sin back upon her. So when she says, I'll go and return to my first husband, for it was better for me then than now, in verse 7, she's using that word return. But it doesn't look like she's really all that interested in it. She's turning back to God, it looks like, just because things are hard. And when things get easy again, she doesn't have any care for God. That's kind of the picture there. And that's the way things go sometimes. When we receive blessings in our lives, things that we know we don't deserve, if you just take a moment of meditation and reflection, a lot of times we forget the giver of those blessings. We forget exactly how we got those blessings. And we like to paint the past as if we did everything ourselves to get those blessings. And we have blind spots of all the various factors that where other people helped us or pitched in, or some event happened that helped your situation, and so on and so forth. But we like to look at, is what we did to get our blessings. And remembering God when things are good is often hard for some people. But those same type of people, when things are bad, who's the first person they blame? God. So when things are good, it's like, well, God's the last one on the mind. But when things are bad, God, why did you do this? You see the inconsistency there. And this is what Israel is doing. Look at chapter 5, verse 4. They might say, oh yeah, God, we really care about you, but their actions speak louder than words. In chapter 5 and verse 4, it says, their deeds do not permit them to return to their God. For the spirit of whoredom is within them, and they know not the Lord. Notice that their deeds do not permit them or allow them to return to their God. I think that's getting at the idea that our actions or behavior and our sinful actions have a way of growing on us and becoming its own monster and master toward us. You see, sinning and not sinning is not just a matter of, well, I'll just do this and then I'll choose not to do it next time. And we think, sometimes we might think that's as simple as it is. But that's not really the reality. The reality is each time you sin, it gets easier to sin. And it gets harder to say no. And the more you sin, the more and more you build habits. And the more the sin takes hold of you. And you no longer become control of yourself. But this monster that you've been feeding takes over. That's the destructiveness of sin. Their deeds do not permit them to return to their God. For the spirit of whoredom is within them, and they know not the Lord. So those are some passages in Hosea that use the word return to talk about sin and to talk about evil and the nature of mankind and how the rebellion against God. But let's look at what God does in response to the sin. And this is our second part. Look at chapter 5 and verse 15. Chapter 5 and verse 15. And starting in verse 13, just to get the context, it says, when Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his wound, then Ephraim went to Assyria and sent to the great king. But he's not able to cure you or heal your wound. For I will be like a lion to Ephraim, and like a young lion to the house of Judah. Even I, will tear and go away. I will carry off, and no one shall rescue. Then he says in verse 15, I will return again. Where? He says, to my place. until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face, and in their distress earnestly seek me. You have this picture of God as if he's sitting there waiting for Israel to acknowledge him, and Israel's not doing it. And so what he does in response is he says, okay, I'm going back home. And he starts walking away. So the people refuse to return to him, and what he does in response is he returns from them. Look at chapter 4, verse 9. Chapter 4, verse 9, this is that statement where like people like priests, and it shall be like people like priests, I will punish them for their ways and repay them for their deeds. That word repay, in my translation, is the same word for return that we've been looking at. And so now God is saying that he is going to return their deeds back on their own heads. You kind of have the idea of the balance of justice there. You get what you put out. And God's the one that makes sure it happens. In chapter 2, in verse 9, in chapter 2, in verse 9, this is the section of where Israel is depicted as an unfaithful wife, and she's been saying, oh, I've got all my blessings from my lovers, and then times are hard, she wants to go back to her husband, but it doesn't look like she's that devoted to him. Well, in verse 9, he says, therefore I will take back my grain in its time and my wine in its season, and I will take away my wool, my flax, which were to cover her nakedness. That word, take back, is the same word for return that we've been seeing. God is saying, I'm going to return all those blessings that I've given you because of your sin and because of your unfaithfulness. In chapter 8, verse 13, chapter 8, verse 13, we looked at this earlier. Chapter 8, verse 13, that's where he says, they shall return to Egypt. There's two other places in Hosea that say that same thing, in chapter 9, verse 3, in chapter 11, verse 5. They shall return to Egypt. Well, what's that idea about? Returning to Egypt. Well, as I mentioned, it's like a reversal of the Exodus. You see, Israel's entire national identity, their entire national existence or status is based on the Exodus, coming out of Egypt. If you take away the Exodus from their history, they're nobody. Coming out of the Exodus, that's when they started becoming a nation. That's when they started becoming a statehood, so to speak, rather than just a big group of people. They started getting their own land and growing. And by him saying, I'm going to send you back to Egypt, I'm going to reverse this whole process that we've been doing. It's a way of saying, I'm going to delete it. Start over. And what we see in Hosea is that it's really a way of describing exile. And it's not so much Egypt, but Assyria that he has in mind. But he's like using Egypt, the word Egypt, for Assyria. And so the Assyrian kingdom's going to come down. He's going to take you. He's going to kill a lot of you. And then he's going to take the rest. And it's going to be like Egypt again. Why? because they were unfaithful to the covenant. They were unfaithful to the covenant. And so if the story stopped there, we would see, well, here is how bad sin is. And this is what God does in response to sin and how He punishes it. It wouldn't be much of a hopeful story. But that's where we see these statements of hope in Hosea. And God uses that word return to describe hope. Look at chapter 12, verse 6. Chapter 12, verse 6. In chapter 12 and verse 6, God is crying out to the people, imploring them to return. And He says, "So you, by the help of your God, return. Hold fast to love and justice, and wait continually for your God." And so he's pleading with them. Return to God. Now that implies He believes they have the ability to. He assumes they still can. All hope is not lost. Look at chapter 11, verse 9. Chapter 11, verse 9 gives us some insight kind of into God's own, you could say, emotions or emotional life. And He shows that He doesn't want to punish anybody. He doesn't find joy in that. He's reluctant to even do it. Look at verse 8. It says, "How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim?" Admah and Zeboim were two cities that were next to Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19 that got destroyed as part of the collateral from Sodom and Gomorrah. And so by Him saying Admah and Zeboim, He's saying, I've got to treat you like Sodom and Gomorrah, and I don't want to. He says, "My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender." That word compassion can also mean like guts. My guts are warm and tender. He's got a soft spot for His people, even when His people are absolutely corrupt. And it says in verse 9, "I will not execute my burning anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim." That word "again" is the same word for our word "return." "I will not again destroy Ephraim." He says, "For I am God and not a man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath." So you kind of get an inside view of what God truly desires and what God really wants. He doesn't want to do any punishment to anybody. Even these extremely wicked people, He is reluctant to do it. And it shows the love and compassion that He really has. Look at chapter 14, verse 4. Chapter 14, verse 4. Here, it speaks as if it's in the past. He says, "I will heal their apostasy, I will love them freely, for my anger has turned from them." My anger has turned from them. In other words, God kind of promises that He's going to turn His anger away. He's not determined to just be angry about His people's unfaithfulness forever. He doesn't like being angry. In chapter 3 and verse 5, even after God makes Israel grow through the punishment of exile and destruction of the northern kingdom, He says in verse 5, on the other side of that suffering and exile, the people of Israel will return. It says, chapter 3, verse 5, afterward the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they shall come in fear to the Lord and to his goodness in the latter days. You see, that's what excites God, his people being faithful. In chapter 11, verse 11, as a result of the people returning to God and renewing their covenant with him, being faithful with him, they get to return to their land. Verse 11, chapter 11, they shall come trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria, and I will return them to their homes, declares the Lord. In chapter 14, verse 7, chapter 14 and verse 7 tells us that they will flourish like a garden. It says, 14 verse 7, they shall return and dwell beneath my shadow. They shall flourish like the grain. They shall blossom like the vine. Their fame shall be like the wine of Lebanon. He describes a time where Israel is going to return to the land and become a great nation, and the whole world's going to know about it. And their fame spreads through the world. That's the picture. I want to read verse 9. This is kind of like this is the end of Hosea, the last statement in Hosea, but he starts using wisdom language to the reader. Kind of saying, make sure you learn the lesson. He says in verse 9, whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the upright walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them. I want you to see that that's kind of like the writer is telling us, this is the main thing I want you to get from this whole book. If you're going to be wise, take all these warnings to heart that Hosea preached to Israel. If you're going to be a smart person, devote yourself to God. Don't be like the Israel. Don't be a transgressor. And so, the point is, in a sense, return. Return to God and keep turning to him, no matter where you find yourself in your life, no matter what stage of life you're in, no matter what age, no matter what circumstances you're going through, no matter what problems you're going through, no matter how deep your sin is, return to God. And that's the beginning of the answer. And we mentioned how God had promised to make Israel like a flourishing garden again. And that's part of the hope of Scripture. And I think it means much more than just Jews getting their land back. I don't really think God's that interested in that concept. He's interested in saving the whole world, blessing the whole world, Jews and Gentiles. And it all goes back to Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, the original promises to Abraham. You got the seed promise, the nation promise. And he says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. $700-something years later, after Hosea's time, there was someone who was in a different garden, and he was praying in the middle of the night. He had 3 friends nearby. They could tell he was stressed to the max. They weren't totally sure what was going on, but he was acting weird. He asked them to stay up and pray with him, but they were so tired they couldn't stay awake. And this man kept praying, not my will be done, but yours. We know that story when Jesus was praying in the garden. You see, that's the thing, is that in order to gain this promise of this type of garden, it requires God Himself to go through death and suffering in the person of Jesus. And so we see in Hosea lessons about sin, lessons about God, and lessons about our hope. But the thing that makes the hope possible is Jesus. His death and His resurrection and His ascension. And we return to God, devote ourselves to God, and He will come again and take us to be home with Him forever. And that place will be much better than a garden. So much better. I appreciate your good attention. I'm going to close by reading chapter 14, verse 9 again, and then we'll sing the song of encouragement. Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the upright walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them. Please stand as we sing.